If China gets such a facility, say in Goda or in Karachi or somewhere, then I think the challenge for India on the seas will dramatically increase. And that's where, for India, the problem is how does it deal?
So, in this week's Raja Mandala, you looked at the cancellation of the Chinese project in the UAE because the US, there was a report, I think, in the Wall Street Journal, which pointed out how it was in the name of dual use, in the name of a civilian sort of project, the Chinese were in fact constructing a military base in the UAE. And after US intervention, the project has been halted for now. One of the things you point out in the column is that China, the word military base is sort of tainted, and it has bad press, and it goes against the nationalist sentiments in most countries. So they have this dual use route, which even whether in Sri Lanka, whether in Pakistan, places in the Indian neighborhood, Djibouti, of course, they have a official military base, the first in 2017. So this dual use route, is it just a question of optics of not saying the word military base, or is there a little bit of subterfuge involved, as it seems in the case of the UAE case right now?
I think it's a good way of getting a foot in the door. Look, China is still not in the US type of position, demanding bases, negotiating. So I think what they're doing is advancing incrementally. Do this now initially so that it's not controversial. It can be justified easily. If you say, look, we're building a port in Hambantota, you justify it on commercial grounds. But when in the future date, it will become like, if you say, look, you put up a depot to supply fuel, that it's not just, it only be limited to commercial ships, but it'll also be, PLA can use it in the future dates. Or if you say, look, repair facilities, what is set up seemingly commercial, but will also be useful for the strategic military purposes. So I think the important thing for them was to get a foot in the door, to do it with least cost at this point of time. But where there's an opportunity, like in Djibouti, go full steam, actually set up a base. So I think it's a strategy, I think, a sensible, least controversial strategy. And the Americans were largely ignoring this, until recently, till the relationship got bad. Americans are saying, look, this is something we can live with it. After all, you remember on Gwadar, where China was supposed to be building something, or in Hambantota, it was not a big deal in the United States. But it's only now when the Americans have woken up to the full implications of China's assertiveness, but they're now taking it up and pushing everyone, look, don't do this, because then it affects our interests in the region. So my sense is Chinese were smart enough to move quietly, slowly, but by asserting themselves, they've actually opened eyes of US or even India today is going to be far more concerned about what they're doing. While they were willing to ignore it or downplay it a few years ago, the nature of the Chinese power has become far more in your face. So therefore, the need to react has become a lot more urgent.
In the column, everyone should read it. It is, of course, on the IndianExpress.com and probably in the description wherever you're watching this video. So you point out, you look at the history of China's, starting out being against military bases, and how there's a real politic. Depending on the state of China's relationships between the Soviet Union, America, great powers, its own needs, it has evolved that position. Now, one of the things they fear, because UAE has been recently, say, Minister Jaishankar, when there was the small meeting with Israel, the US, and the UAE, and Foreign Minister Jaishankar has been pointing out how the UAE is a close friend of India's at this point. Is there a danger, say, and the UAE has claimed that they were not aware that this was happening till the American intelligence thing pointed it out. Is there a danger now that that most countries have to do business with China? It's too large an economy, including the US on the one hand. Is it now to separate and to manage the Chinese assertiveness in China's own strategic plans with the economic aspects of bilateral and multilateral relationships with China? Separating the strategic aspect and the economic aspect, is it going to become tougher going forward, do you think?
No, I think the problem is inherent in this. But the trust of China was so deep. For example, in the Middle East, they had no direct quarrels with China. They had no territorial disputes like Vietnam or Philippines. So they were quite happy to take China on its face value and say, look, you want to build a container terminal, come and build it. It's a commercial deal. But the Chinese were using that trust to do things. But now Americans are noticing and telling their friends, look, this is not acceptable because there will be costs to your relationship with the United States. So I think once people figure this out, it should not be too difficult to separate the two out. Because China is still a large economy and people can't simply say, look, we don't want to do business with China. I mean, India had a specific reason. Even India can't fully decouple. So in the Middle East, actually, they were really looking forward to a deeper engagement with China. So now they'll be careful. Say UAE, because it's a close partner for the US, it is willing to now say, look, okay, I mean, they have to publicly say we didn't know about it. Yeah. Maybe they didn't until evidence was presented to them. But today, they'll be far more careful, America's partners. But for Iran, for example, which has bad relations with the US, will it be more open for Chinese military bases? That's one kind of question that we have to see. But then the Iranians also very conscious of their sovereignty. They don't like foreign countries setting up bases in them. So that's one interesting case of how Iran might react to it. Or Pakistan, for example. Yeah. Pakistan has been the most open for China's military bases in that sense, because US and China had no quarrel and Pakistan was the best friend for both. Engaging China in more military cooperation didn't seem to have an effect on the US relationship. But today for Pakistan too, can they go full steam with China? Because Gwadar, we've talked a lot about it. In fact, far more important than Gwadar is Karachi actually, where the Chinese Navy has had historically a presence and all the building ships for Pakistan Navy. So there is a lot of talk about integration of Pakistan Navy and the Chinese Navy. For India, it will be a huge difference. The Chinese actually have a base in Karachi or Gwadar. Then the effect of that on India would be huge. But I don't think the Pakistanis will think twice about India's concerns. But if the US says, look, Karachi and Gwadar are next to the Gulf of, which is oil-rich Gulf. And if you do anything there, it will have consequences for American interests. So how would Pakistan deal with the US-China conflict when it has had good relationship? They'll get into trouble. So the rest of the region, which is traditionally US friends, will know how to separate things. But for others, it will be far more trickier in terms of how this actually plays out.
So, follow up to this, just on the Pakistan question, just today, the other big story on China was that in Gwadar, there's been a lot of people's protests. I mean, the people of Pakistan, what I think you hint at in the column, that there is such a thing as nationalist sentiment. So how do you think that balances out going forward? Because it's clear that the Pakistan state, including Imran Khan, who was otherwise, say, vis-a-vis India, the greatest, Pakistani nationalist, has batting for Pakistan. Batting for China, because that seems to be the Pakistan state thing. Whereas
I think
there seems to be some kind of
I think the Chinese were very conscious of the nationalist resentment. After all, the whole non-aligned movement, India, many countries, nobody wants to. They think foreign bases are against sovereignty. Yeah. So that's why they don't want to call them bases. They would call them facilities. For example, we know that Pakistan hosts some satellite relay stations of China. Okay, they're below the threshold. I mean, they're not threatening. But for China, the expectation would be, given the depth of the relationship, Pakistan Army will find ways to protect Chinese interests, assuming they get a base. At this point, it's not clear what exactly they have. But if the Pakistan Army says, look, we can't manage domestic public opinion, then they'll have an issue. But Pakistan has hosted American bases, so why should they have a problem hosting Chinese bases? In the past, I mean, U-2 flights, there was a lot of opposition to those. But Pakistan Army managed to, they're letting Americans bomb their own territory. If you remember the drone attacks on Waziristan, they were letting Americans bomb their own territory. But they had negotiated a deal with the Americans. So I would say in Pakistan, there is protest in Balochistan, not in a general terms, because it's a marginalized area. There's a lot of resentments there. And in fact, you remember the Pakistan Army had created a special division to look after Chinese interests on the Belt and Road Initiative. And Gwadar is so sensitive. I think Pakistan would go any length to secure that interest. But the problem for Pakistan is not as much the Baloch protests, but it is the American concerns. how they will manage that, because you can't ride two horses at the same time. As long as they were friendly horses, it was all right. But today, the problem for Pakistan would be, can they really tell the Americans, it's none of your business, I'm going to do with China what I do? And as far as the Chinese are concerned, that's the reason why they were looking at small states. Yeah. Like in large countries, there's always going to get into politics. Now, for example, that's why you look for island states where you can have a deal with the ruling elite or with the ruling family, and they say, look, okay, we give you this, you give us a base in return. That's what the Americans used to do in the past. Small island states, it was easy. Beyond the alliances like Australia, Germany, where Americans openly deployed bases, and because the host countries had problems of their own. In the developing countries, bases always generate problems. So managing that is a big issue. Even in small countries, look at the whole problem India had in Seychelles. Yeah. India was building a facility for Seychelles. Now, moment the word got out that it is bases, the opposition party wouldn't help ratify the agreement. So it got stuck. So India will also have the same problems, because in Maldives, for example, there is this whole protest movement saying India should get out of Maldives because India is trying to draw Maldives into a deeper military relationship. So that is natural. I think it depends a lot on your skill of how to manage those. And I think the Chinese have more instruments at their disposal in terms of monetary benefits, infrastructure benefits. So I think, but this is exactly what the Americans and Russians faced in the Cold War. Yeah. There were instances wherein one country would throw out the Americans and get the Russians in. Another country would throw the Russians out and get the Americans in. Or you bargain your position. So all that has been part of the story of foreign bases. And I think we'll see a lot of that playing out in the case of China. For India, the problem is if China gets a permanent presence in the Indian Ocean, for example, in Pakistan, then the naval balance, so far the naval balance was all in India's favor. But if, like America has Digo Garcia, where they can deploy their navy, put their equipment, put their whole lot of things. If China gets such a facility, say in Goda or in Karachi or somewhere, then I think the challenge for India on the seas will dramatically increase. And that's where, for India, the problem is how does it deal?
So well, you already covered it more or less, but in the article also you talk about how Delhi had a sort of an almost ideological position and a non-negotiable one on basis, which of course it's evolved from or trying to in the last few years, without as much success as we'd like or without as much speed as we'd like. Do you think because like you say, China has that many more arrows in its quiver, both in terms of military hardware that it can provide, in terms of economic benefits, in terms of a whole host of things. Where do you think Delhi should be looking to focus its energies in that sense? What is the leverage point we have? And also, do you think that this is something, say, I think Admiral Raja Menon as well as Admiral Arun Prakash, two former Navy chiefs, have written for us in the recent past. And their thing has been that our strategic outlook has been far too terrestrial so far, whereas it is the maritime domain where the new frontier is and where you have real economic interests as well. Do you think that's something that a reimagining that needs to happen, not diplomatically as well as strategically?
Absolutely. I think the problem for India has been, before independence, the Indian Army was an expeditionary force. It was interested in the territorial security, but it was also an expeditionary force. And the Royal Navy looked after the Indian Ocean. That there was no, that there was no naval challenge to the dominance of the Royal Navy. After independence, the partition, what it did was the breakup of India and the disputes that it left meant that the military energies were now devoted to resolving the partition-induced issues in Kashmir, in the border conflicts with Pakistan. And then China entered Tibet, which means you had a new border with another powerful nation and that dispute. So these two disputes actually left India dealing with this massive boundary disputes in the northwestern frontiers. And therefore, India did not really invest in the Navy because the priority, even now, if you talk to the Army guys, get the most of the budget. The Air Force gets a little bit, the Navy gets the least. So there is a problem to think about the maritime side. While Admiral Raja Menon or Admiral Arun Prakash, they say, look, in the end, your leverages with China are in the naval side, where you have open territory, you are based in the Indian Ocean, you can do a lot more interesting things rather than just sticking more troops in the border. But Army is not buying that agreement, that argument, and the politicians will believe when they actually devote more resources to the Navy. So I think we have a problem there because the priority of domestic insurgencies, border disputes, continue to drag India into the territorial defense in the Himalayas rather than in the possibilities in the oceans. So I think that remains a major challenge. But and that's the reason why, if you work more closely with your partners, because you can't devote more budget. But if you work with the Americans, if you work with Australians, if you work with the Japanese, you can generate leverages on the ground, which is what the Quad is about, which is what the maritime cooperation that we're doing. But in terms of the ideology, because we had connections which we gave up because we said it's not correct to have a military kind of basis of facilities. But today, that policy has been changed, but we don't have the capabilities, for example. India doesn't make too many arms. If you don't make arms, you can't sell arms. That's a huge advantage China has. Cheap arms, not as great as American arms, but they can create friends and capabilities. They can give more aid. They can build infrastructure. So, but India is doing things. So we can only do few things. Therefore, concentrate on your neighborhood to deny space to China. That is, intervene in politically, diplomatically, to encourage Sri Lanka, Maldives not to give bases to China, while at the same time reaching out to your traditional friends in the Gulf, in the Western Indian Ocean. Look, how do we extend our military reach? So those are some of the strategies, but we'll have to work in coalition with others. We don't have singly match the Chinese resources. So that requires an answer, not matching them issue to issue, but are building coalitions where we can pool our resources to deal with the China challenge.
Right. Thank you so much, sir. We'll see you next week.